Our speaker today is JoDee, and she's the program director of the Master's IOP Psychology at Bellevue University. Her focus and research revolves around two core elements, which is human-centered design and creative collaboration supporting innovation. These principles are not only personal areas of interest, but also are crucial for understanding the dynamic nature of IO psychology, which I love, that innovative part. So
Yes.
she's going to be talking about various things during our presentation today. I know you're going to be presenting on a little bit of different topics, research and practice, and some approaches. So she's going to be discussing how graduate students in IO psychology are particularly valuable in their ability to incorporate diverse areas of research and perspectives, which is something that we talked about last week too. And then that way they can inform their work to meet the needs in various departments, roles, teams, and settings. And one, which I love that we're going to have this conversation today, because that was one of my conversations earlier this week with some of the SEBOC members about how do I know how to integrate my abilities and my skills into the job I landed, because it doesn't sound like it's IO related at all. And
Yep.
then thankfully you have some great mentors that were like, yeah, that's IO. And I was like, what? So please blow our minds because it's
Yes. So I do have some slides to just kind of talk through, but like Gabby mentioned, these seem to kind of be more laid back. I definitely want to touch on topics or questions that you all have. I haven't attended one of these sessions, so I don't want to be repetitive either. So yes, definitely jump in or redirect me here based on what is most interesting or maybe what other people have chatted with you all about. So
And
here.
JoDee, I wouldn't worry too much about being repetitive. I think every speaker's perspective, even if it's on the same thing, it's very different. So we definitely appreciate having your perspective on, even if it's the same topic, which I doubt. But I mean, there's recurrent things for sure. But I'm really curious to hear your perspective. So.
Yeah, so and just kind of going off of what Gabby sent me, I of course wanted to give you all a little background about myself. So I'm JoDee Goracke. I am the program director of the Masters in IO Psychology at Bellevue University. I've been the program director since 2016, and it's completely online. And so at the time, there weren't very many masters online, IO online programs. And what really drew me to Bellevue was I think just the university overall is incredibly inclusive. And so it was kind of this unique situation of it really aligned with my personal values. And then just kind of a unique challenge of how to launch an online IO program that provides community on a really authentic way and that students are facilitated interaction. Yeah, so that's how I landed at Bellevue and kind of what's kept me there this long. Um, I participate in a wide variety of projects, and I kind of the gist of putting these up here is to kind of demonstrate I'm a little bit all over the place, but really the core of me being a founder or supporting projects is, oh, I see a question here. Okay. Oh, if it was just a chat. Okay. Sorry, I'm used to like teaching and doing this. So I'm like, oh yes, I gotta get in here. Yeah, so I'm a founder and project lead for something called the Tanzania Design Project. This is really my passion area, but it's also something I carry through in the entire program, part of how we built it, part of how I support student work and their practicum and their capstone. And it's really around like being empathy driven. So how do you really consider the human experience in what it is you're trying to solve for and incorporate that into any process you're doing? So the work I do in Tanzania is helping students understand a process to identify problems and apply a structure to that. And ultimately, the goal of this project is that students create businesses around those problems they've identified in their communities. So I've been doing that since 2016 as well, and I go to Tanzania once a year to support that project work. And then I'm also a co-founder of the Art and Science Incubator. Again, just trying to highlight my passion is in the doing side of things. which is, again, kind of why I've stayed on like the applied side of IO psychology. And I'm really passionate about supporting students who are really solely interested in applying their degrees. You know, they're wanting to be in the workplace as well. Okay. So again, Gabby mentioned that might be of interest, kind of how I got to where I am today. So I actually started my undergrad in ceramics and I played the violin. So I was in music and art to start. And then kind of realized that I wanted to do more on the human side. So psychology, I think, always resonated with me. I think I was always driven to like give back in some way, you know, and not just be working on like my individual art approach. So I went to KU and I ultimately ended up switching into psychology. Um, and while I was there, I started working for the Center for Research Methods and Data Analysis, doing quantitative psych consulting, and then ultimately majored in cognitive psychology was my undergrad work. And while I was at KU, again, I think something that was always driving me and trying to connect with people, I think that human connection approach was always central to me trying to find a career path. I also was a crisis intervention counselor for suicide intervention. I think just testing the waters of, you know, do I want to go clinical? Do I want to go abnormal psych? Even in cognitive psychology, you know, do I want to support more of like the crisis situations? And again, this is kind of a long way of saying was my personal exploration of where do I want to fit this in? You know, how do I support other people in the best way that's most functional for me? Um, so I ultimately decided, obviously, I didn't go, you know, the clinical counseling side of psychology. Um, and so I graduated and moved to Omaha because I got a job for, it's called the Center for Public Affairs Research. And so what I did there is I did more community level research. So it wasn't just academic research. So I was going into Native American reservations and doing health studies. I was doing a lot of like rural town training on how they could collect data to make the case for funding for their community. Naturally, a lot of that has to do with like resources for hospitals or clinics or to get city workers paid. And so just doing a lot of like boots on the ground training, both on like Native American reservations and also like small townships or villages in Omaha. And then from there, I was on the UNO campus and applied to the IO Psych program, completed my graduate degree there. And then ultimately ended up actually doing a lot of research and writing a large grant that we won through the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security, which again, I think what I learned through this journey was understanding how flexible your knowledge can be in different situations. You know, me starting in ceramics and that creativity I had being applicable writing a Department of Defense grant, you know, that it was a similar mindset, a similar structure of how do I absorb different perspectives? How do I communicate that in different ways? And I think that really winning that grant for the Department of Homeland Security, I think was a huge eye-opening moment for me of like, oh, okay, I really just have to understand how to speak the language of the people that I'm talking to. It's not that I need to completely relearn everything or go get a degree in counterterrorism, you know, to understand what it is they're looking for, but I do have to understand how to speak their language. So that's kind of what my path to leading to where I'm at today and the projects that I've taken on. And human-centered design and diverse teams is really what is the static point through all of my projects, through all of the work I do. And really and that's really how I support my students, is understanding how to put a framework to solving a problem, solving their assignments, considering what career paths they want to go into. And the consistent thing and the teaching that is that you have to understand the people that you're working with ultimately. So whether that's business operations, whether that's, you know, a global company and you have to quickly understand the culture that you're coming into, whether that's artists, or community members, that it's really a framework and a frame of mind that you have to understand how to maneuver and kind of be that chameleon, which is where I think IOs are incredibly powerful and really valuable. So before I go, is there any questions for those things?
If you guys don't want to speak up, you can always use the chat. So please feel, yes, Apayami.
Greetings, everyone. I'm just juggling, so I'm glad I was able to join.
Yes.
Thank you so much for what you presented so far, and I'm just, uplifted by the power of your work and what you've done. And what particularly resonated with me was when you talked about navigating space on indigenous reservations. And I know for me, that would inform some of the work that I do that centers around restorative practices. So how did you navigate that space? That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah. So I think, and going back to this, so this is a picture of me as well. So that's me in Tanzania with, so a lot of these students are Maasai, which would kind of be similar. Like those are really like the native tribes in Tanzania. And I think going into any cultural space is always brought with being incredibly humble, and it's always eased into as well. So being hyper aware that you need to be really have a lot of humility in that situation, that you are almost, kind of go through the questioning and the vetting that they need to take of you in order to welcome you into their space as a safe person. Um, and also, I mean, I never enter these spaces as someone who's coming in to take over, or I'm never the one leading it. I always kind of have someone native to those communities that are really championing what it is I'm doing. And kind of how I explain the work I do and what I did in with the Native American groups, and then also what I do in Tanzania, is I try and really just support with the resources and honestly the privilege that we have as, in the US, in particular with Tanzania, that I'm incredibly humble that the teachers there are incredibly skilled at what they're doing. And I'm really just there kind of supporting the work they're doing to make it easier for them. So in entering any type of, sorry, go ahead.
So how did you initiate just getting that invitation? What was that
Yeah.
initiation process? How did you
Yeah.
navigate that?
Yeah.
Getting
So
invited.
yes, yes. So honestly, and this is part of my advice for at the end of it, is I tell my students, and again, I'm just because of the work I do, I really drive my students to be engaged in their immediate communities. If they want to be entering and supporting, like whether it's a neighborhood of need or a specific community of need, that they need to be showing up regularly so that they know that that you're kind of that safe space and that you're not just dropping in and trying to attach your name to getting credit for something, that you are there and you're consistent. So that would be number one, is you're showing up and you're consistent with those community members, and you're kind of putting that time in to build that relationship. Um, so I mean, some of it is I think through all of my work, I've really been driven to get perspectives from a lot of different people. Like that's always been of interest to me. I think I've always been drawn to like, oh, I don't know what that experience is like. I want to learn more. That's always been something that I've sought out is kind of a discomfort in learning about other people's journeys. And so I naturally just kind of attend a lot of different meetings. And really, I attend a lot of different types of professional groups because I like hearing what it is they're talking about, okay, I want to hear about what marketing's doing. I want to hear about what community leaders are doing. So again, I think it's just having some consistency in being in attendance in different circles, and you kind of you start to realize, people who resonate with you and saying, okay, I see what you're doing here. You have a skill set. I could see how we could plug you into this. There's a need here. But again, those relationships really have to be authentically built, and consistently kind of nurtured in order to get there. So the Native American reservation, it was a researcher who he himself was Native American. And I think just through him watching me navigating conversations, questions I was asking, things that I have done. At KU, I was actually there's an all-native school called Haskell University that I did some work at as well. So again, he kind of realized that, but I didn't realize that he was, I think, kind of observing what I was talking about at the time. So I think just being yourself and communicating like what your interests, your passions, that there are those people that see you, over time and kind of can see how you can work together. Yeah.
I have a quick question real quick.
Yeah.
So with your background with the suicide prevention specialist, how do you feel like that mental health background contributed to your later education and efforts and different things like that and where you're at currently?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's impacted every aspect of my life. I think one, in me doing that, it's like that Dunning-Kruger effect. When I went into being a suicide intervention counselor, again, I was really young in retrospect. And my intentions were really good, but I had no idea what I was about to get into. I
Yeah.
think and again, it was a really good reality check for me. Because I think I was like, oh, I can take a phone call here, talk people through things, and not realizing, once I got there, it was like, oh my God, there's like the demand, the types of people you were talking through their issues with, that you had to be supportive regardless of whether you agreed with what they were doing at the time. So yeah, and I think it was something that I underestimated how difficult it would be to disconnect or like offload that
Yeah.
emotional weight after you are counseling, so you would take shifts maybe from 11 to 5 a.m., and you would get people who would try and come to the door and do in-person counseling sessions and things like that. It was a point in which I realized that I don't have the capacity to go into counseling myself. But again, I think it was a really, really good reality check for myself of how much I didn't understand about, I think, just about people in general, and the struggles that they face, whether that's, my students in Tanzania, even the teachers in Tanzania that I work with, even my students, in the program, and being aware of just like what people are going through. I think it was a really huge reality check, and it's hard to dissect for me to say like how exactly it impacted me, because I think about it a lot.
Yeah.
And it was a life-changing experience, and it really helped kind of put me in my place of, okay, you need to be more humble and observant and questioning before you jump to like, how to solve everyone's problems.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and that's really, this is the model we use for the social design class I teach I teach it at Bellevue. I also teach it in Tanzania. Well, I teach it to the teachers who teach it to the students in Tanzania. And the emphasis here is really on this empathizing part, which again, us pushing so hard on the empathy piece, I often think about and use an example of the crisis intervention counseling as part of what I teach, and being aware of how much it is you don't know about someone or about the problem, even if you know of the problem, and just being very self-aware and questioning that as you're going through solving problems. So again, Gabby sent me that a question that you guys like to chat about is what is the value of IOs? How do you put into perspective, what it is you're coming out of school with and how it's valuable? And what I see a lot with my students is this discomfort again, that there's not this like point A to point B conversion into a job title, that you're not getting an engineering degree and that you're looking for the engineering job role title. But I also think that's the beauty of it, that you're not pigeonholed, that we really have this interdisciplinary learning structure, that you're having to understand a lot of different disciplines and communicate in different ways by the time you graduate. So you're going through human resources topics, you're going through human factors engineering, business economics, quantitative and data science, sociology, social psychology, and other things depending on what it is your program covers. And again, my epiphany moment of like, wow, this is powerful, was that Department of Homeland Security grant I worked on. And what we ultimately ended up doing is what won us the grant was that we used a combination of, it was like marketing and branding models and organizational development models that we were overlaying onto terrorist organizations, and saying that these terrorist groups are essentially using a similar model to what businesses use, and that's what won us the grant. And again, that they found it really interesting to pull in those like cross-disciplinary models and topics and to talk about it in a counterterrorism forum. And so it's actually, the grant has grown into a really big thing since I've left graduate school. They're their own department now. And again, that it was like, it's not, I think once you hear it, you think like, of course, yeah, that makes sense. But people aren't naturally all the time inclined to talk about things in an interdisciplinary way, to say like, okay, that's essentially this, and like, let's bring these pieces in. And again, I think that that's the really unique and dynamic value of what IOs bring. And then part of that, if as you're going through this interdisciplinary learning, you're naturally acquiring this analytical, creative thinking. So you're having to understand, like, have this rigor to understanding how you identify a problem. And again, what I see a lot of times with students is that they really sometimes hate that there's not a black and white answer, or that you could maybe someone in the same class might identify and scope a problem slightly differently than what their peers are. But that's the way the world works. There's not someone saying this is this specific problem you need to solve, and then that will make everything work. And so I think it's IOs kind of gain a skill set of being used to that discomfort of the ambiguity. And then through that, it's not just that you understand how to identify a problem, but you have like this research methods framework. So you really have some structure to say, okay, this is how we're going to start with it. This is how we break it down. These are how I'm going to quantify, successes. These are the metrics we're looking at. And it's really where that research methods structure and discussion of problems and solutions is where I see my students really turn heads, in meetings and presentations, that they're able to discuss like that structure of their process and their thought. Whether everyone agrees with, what they ended with is up for discussion, but that they have a structure and they weren't just kind of spitballing what they subjectively think should be done. And then also, with IO being industrial organizational psychology, most students and most graduates are usually innately interested in how the knowledge you're learning, the academic knowledge you're learning, and the research you're gathering actually applies and functions in the real world, which isn't always the case, in graduate degrees in psychology pathways. They might be more interested in just purely experimental psychology. But where I think IO's value is that usually if you signed up to complete a graduate degree in IO psychology, you're really driven to understand how the knowledge you're learning functions in the workplace. So something I've been talking with my students with a lot is this year, there have been all of these articles that have come out, all of these reports that have come out talking about the shift in workplace needs and workplace skills. And something that I thought was great, there was a New York Times article that came out this year, I think it was in February, but it said in the past jobs were about muscles. So talking about like industrial labor work. Now they're about brains, but in the future they'll be about the heart. And I think this pulls through in this World Economic Forum, the Future of Jobs report that they put out, and looking at creative thinking, curiosity of lifelong learning, motivation and self-awareness across industries, across countries, that these were the top skills that all employers were identifying as being the skills that are on the rise, which is interesting. I think everyone's talking about how AI is going to affect the workplace and the work we're doing. And it's really this creative thinking, this analytical thinking, this understanding of how you tackle problems that is going to be in high demand, that humanity of understanding like how people are interacting that AI isn't going to be able to do. You're not going to be able to plug that in. You're not going to be able to understand that human to human nuances and interactions. And so again, IO's having that really unique skill set of marrying both like an understanding of interdisciplinary awareness, but also really being hungry to apply what it is they're learning in the workplace.
And can I just add to what you were just saying?
Yeah.
That this week I was able to finally have a visual. I'm a visual person, and I feel like for industrial and organizational psychology, that industrial side is the technical, the brain, and the organizational is the heart. And I think as IOs, I feel like it's a superpower because we bring both. If we find our place and if we do it correctly, I feel like we can definitely create this very balanced idea of here's the heart. We see the psychological and this very just humanistic perspective of work, of things, of an organization, but also here's this other technical aspect that I can also understand. And I know it sounds like a dream, but because it can be a very hard thing to just focus on balancing that, right? But I think it's a pretty cool way of looking at it. And I loved what you said about the muscles, the brain, and the heart, because that's, I think, technically what our work is essentially driving that heart with hardcore evidence. So I like that a lot.
Yeah. And so I teach, it's called Thinking by Design, and it's the social design method I talked about. And I cover this, report with them. Because really the gist of what I emphasize in that class, but also in my program overall, is this creative thinking. And I think that that's where education is seeing that there's a gap happening because there's been such a push for technical skills. And also when you look at what do they mean by creative thinking? What do they mean by analytical thinking? And if you actually dig into that World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report, and what employers are saying is needed there is really creative problem solving. So people who aren't waiting to be told what the issue is. They're not waiting to be assigned a workflow process. That they're people who are saying, okay, is this what we need to be doing? There's this other thing that I can see is coming up, and I'm anticipating this, and I have that creative thinking, that analytical thinking, which again, not to like toot our own horns, but I think that that's really where IO's strong skill set is that you have been built to, again, be comfortable with that discomfort of saying, this isn't clearly laid out for me here. I wasn't told, again, like, here's the black and white problem you're dealing with, and I'm going to be grading you on this black and white response that there's so many shades of gray and different colors in the problems you're presented with. And again, that's where I really see IOs having a stronger foothold in this creative and analytical thinking space.
A question I have for you is how, like, in the application world of talking about the, like, saying all these skills for an interviewer or recruiter that does not understand IO, and then you have to like go through like the 14 syllables of the whole industrial organizational psychology to explain to them, like, how do you go about like showing rather than telling that you have those skills because of the field that you're in, without coming off as just assuming and the recruiter's just thinking that you're blowing up your skills a lot more than you are?
Yeah, and that's a good question because I think it's tricky depending on what it is you're applying to.
Yeah.
I mean, one really basic response is making sure like your resume is tailored to the language they're looking for, which, I mean, I'm sure you're probably thinking of that already. What I've seen is students who say are more interested in business operations versus an HR role. They might be using HR type terminology for projects, and that I really coach them through, okay, that's not what's going to resonate with these hiring managers. You did the same thing, you did what they're asking, but you really do need to, again, speak their language, even on the most basic level of how you describe the projects you did, say, in graduate school, what that means to business operations and why that transfers and translates in their world, and that you really do that legwork as you're applying to different disciplines.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and I think it's a small tweak, but it saves you, I think, a lot of headache of trying to backtrack and say like, oh no, but I did that. That's where I'm, in my resume where I talked about this, that, and, you're kind of, it almost seems like you're stretching what it is you're saying if they don't understand, what all went into those projects, that you really have to lay that groundwork for them to understand and that it's already translated for them.
I definitely feel that because I've talked with different HR professionals. I've also like applied to HR master's programs. And if you don't have that like flavor of like HR plastered on like your experience or anything like that, you're just like, oh, you're not part of the club. Sorry. You have to be with the in crowd. Like, sorry. Like, I don't know what IO is. And so
well, and I think it's funny to me because like in HR that they're looking for very specific things. And I think that's, they have the certifications like SHRM or HRCI that, it's legible in their working space of like, yep, we've all kind of agreed this is the certification that carries weight for us. Which I think that there's a shift happening, but you really have to search for like those HR leaders who understand, like, again, not like the black and white skill set they're looking for. And ultimately, I mean, it comes down to it's easier to just look for like the skill set that is black and white, that is like, oh, you told me exactly what I wanted to see. I didn't have to think about it at all.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's frustrating, but I think as someone applying, especially if you're trying to break into a space, it's worth doing that legwork of translating that for them.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Sorry. I saw some in the chat. Do I need to answer? I didn't open it. Was there
So
a
they're just
question?
asking if they're going to be able to get the slides. And as far as the recording goes, we are recording so we can develop a resource on SEBOC.com, but that's still not up just yet. So the recordings are not available just yet, but I will let JoDee answer about the slides.
Yeah, I can absolutely share this with you all after we get off of here. I'll send it to Gaby, and then I'm assuming, Gaby, you have the list of people on the call today. So my advice for graduate students that I had, and this was kind of the last point Gaby asked me to touch on, and what I tell my students, I kind of just was just reflecting on what I cover with my students in orientation and then their capstone, is networking with intention. So I think networking, I think I always had like, it almost had like this ick feeling to it of like, I just don't, it almost feels like I'm like pulling something from people, or that, you know, I'm talking to people and wanting something from them. And I really have had a shift in that. And I think that that's been through me attending so many community meetings, that I think the best networking situations is where you find people and there's mutual benefit in that relationship you're building. And that I think it feels less awkward when you really have done like some serious personal reflection on what it is you want to do, what your passions are, so that those conversations are really genuine. And it's not just kind of like, oh, we're here and you're IO and I'm IO and I just want you to know my name, you know, that you have really done some self-reflection on what it is you want to do, so that you're not wasting your time, you're not wasting whoever the person it is you're networking with. That it's really kind of that almost like, you know, a growth of a friendship and not purely like a business interaction. The next one is that you capitalize on your unique window as a graduate student on many levels. So capitalize on it by, yes, networking. It's generally easier to network with people, especially people that might be incredibly interesting, have a lot of really interesting success stories or interesting projects. People tend to be a lot more open to talking to students versus professionals. Just there seems to be, you know, a little bit more hesitation and, you know, why are you reaching out to me? What do you want from me? Is there an angle here? Whereas if they know that you're an IO graduate student or just a graduate student in general, people tend to be really generous with their knowledge and their time. So understanding that and using this window of time to really leverage those conversations. And then push yourself to apply learning and your projects. And then also, I think, and what I mean by that is in graduate school, hopefully whatever program you're in allows you to have some independent projects where you identify topics of interest, you identify areas of research. And again, you really take the time to self-reflect on what it is you want to do after graduation. Maybe the gaps that you have in your skill set or maybe in your resume to move into that career space. And you use those projects to build that portfolio to make the case, you know, like you were saying, Brigham, that yes, I can do this. And kind of here is the case that I've done it in a really thorough way. And then it's not just applying that learning. I really like to see when students follow through with it. And again, this is kind of a personal passion and driver of mine, is that students don't just stop with investigating something. And I think that that's naturally where humans fall short, is in like the follow through execution of projects, because that's where it gets hard, is following through. So if you do start a project and you're working with a mentor, or you've started networking with someone and you kind of came up with something you might look into, that you don't kind of leave that flat, that you really push yourself to follow through on, if you said you wanted to help with something, or you wanted to provide information, again, that you push yourself to follow through on something that you were looking into, or building, or starting to launch. That's really where the value comes in, I think, for both you and whoever it is you're working with. And then the last one is just engaging. And I think it sounds simple, but it's actually really, really hard. And I mean, the fact that you guys are all here speaks volumes, because engaging is difficult. But not just engaging in the sense of like figuring out where you understand like academic communities, but where I think work, and I think IO work or business applied work can really, I think, eat at people, is when you're not bringing your personal passions, your personal interests into the work that you're doing. So yes, IO is talking about organizational processes, identifying problems for businesses, but what drives you? How can you bring in, whether it's, I've somehow found a way to bring in, my passion for arts and creativity into the work I'm doing as an IO. And it took some creative thinking of how do I weave that in? How do I make that case? Because again, it's not even legible to a lot of IOs to say, okay, yes, creative thinking, but it's more of like an individual process, not creativity as a community, creativity as an interdisciplinary approach. But it was something that I knew I needed to figure out how to make that work in order for me to like really find fulfillment in the work that I'm doing. So yeah, so the engaging, not just in like your coursework in your academic communities, but again, really thinking about like what interests you and how do you bring your skill set, your value to those personal passions and interests. Okay, so that's all I had.
And I'm going to add to that real quick. And please feel free to ask questions and keep the conversation going, everybody. But I noticed that a lot of IOs have almost this professional role, and then they have their passion projects. It could be their business, it could be their founders or co-founders of another, something that is very much related. But I feel like you really just took it home with bring your passions and interests, because IO, sometimes depending on where you land, it can be a very technical job that it's not very creative, it's not very heart related. And I feel like as IOs, we're in this field because we also crave that other side. And I think that's something that's very popular, to have this your professional path, and then you have this other things that you're constantly evolving and exposing yourself to various conversations, or just various projects or ideas, and meeting different people. And I feel like balancing those two can really feel what you're doing, because again, finding a job in IO can be challenging when you don't know what it is that you want to do. So those are some pretty awesome actionable steps. Does anybody have any thoughts, any comments that you want to add? Patrick, yes.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I think it's interesting to remember that there will be very few job titles that actually say IO psychologist, right? With the exception of people in government. For the most part, it's stuff like people analytics or HR. type roles. So I think it's really important to kind of, as you guys have mentioned, tailor one's skills that they've gotten through graduate school towards getting that position. So, and also I think it's important to know where you want to end up for when you choose a graduate program. Like I know this is all about Bellevue, but there are, just make sure you weight all of the different options because master's programs in IO psychology are going through a boom cycle where there's a lot of different master's programs which vary in quality. I think Bellevue is high quality, or otherwise they wouldn't be here and they wouldn't have such a great director. But I think it's really important to remember that you don't want to give your money away willy-nilly. So I just think that's really important. And I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yes, I think we're in an age where you really do need to be critical consumers of that investment in yourself, of the school that you're going to, of the right fit for the structure of the program. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, online doesn't work for everyone. I think online, depending on who the program director is, means something very different at each institution as well. So I think kind of being ready with that toolkit of, how do I start investigating, the program or the pathway that fits me. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Patrick.
I'm glad that you brought that up because this actually started because when I graduated, I had no clue. I'm a first generation, so nobody sat down and said, hey, you should probably do some research or have conversations. I mean, what you just shared would have been gold 2 years before I graduated, right? So I think also it's really good to create more spaces where we're having these conversations and where we're sharing with other students like, hey, you may want to get ahead on this. Have you thought about this? And that's kind of where this passion project got created because I feel like there's not a lot of information on how do you get from point A to point D in this field. Because it's so diverse, right? And everybody has many different paths. And not one of the speakers that we've had has had a similar path. Everybody's just very different lifestyles and very different professional and academic backgrounds. So that's super interesting too.
Yeah. And I will say, I mean, some background I didn't touch on was, so I went to large research institutions. In my graduate program, I was a single mom, and it was really difficult for me. So I was a non-traditional student and, I was asked to stay on to do research and it just wasn't a right fit for me, but is also what has driven me to make the Bellevue program what it is, because I think, let's be completely honest, IO is also of interest because it's a psychology space that you can make a good living off of. And I think that, of course, we're altruistic and we love people, but I think ultimately what drives people to exploring it is that it's like, oh, I can make a decent living if I have this graduate psychology degree. And so, it was really important to me to create space that it created an inclusive environment for non-traditional students to get a graduate degree in IO psychology, but also making sure I didn't lose sight of the value I got being on the ground at a research institution, which really largely was the network that you take away from it. So, again, I weave it into the program extensively, almost to the point where I drive my students crazy. But I can't emphasize enough how much the power of your network really drives, potential projects, connections, things like that. So absolutely investing in that, especially if you are taking an online pathway.
I like that. I feel like the community and networking as a student, if you start early, I feel like it's the best way because then you get to get past the awkwardness and all the weird things that come up as you're networking. Then by the time you hit the professional networking spaces, then you feel more confident, then you figured out what works for you. I used to be very against like small talk and talk about like
Yeah.
this little things. And now I'm like, well, that's a lot of people feel comfortable with sharing where they're at and what are they doing, and you get to know people, and really we're in psychology, we're curious about people. So it's interesting that we're able to bring in that aspect too and create these communities that you're talking about, because they're so important. They're the ones that are going to propel you wherever you have to go, or your path that's going to come from those conversations. So I'm an introvert and I don't really thrive in that, but I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed having
Yeah.
conversations with other people.
Yeah.
Pretty fun.
Absolutely.
And I definitely agree about like when people call it a field, it's definitely a field. There's no like set way. You're like literally just in the middle of the field. They're just like, hey, welcome
In
to
the prairie.
IO. Yeah, in the prairie, just welcome to IO. And you're just like, okay, where do I go from here? And they're just like, oh, everyone makes their own way, just go over wherever you want. But most people go and take their own paths in a different place. And
Yeah.
then they just have their little passion projects of like mounds of dirt over here. And
Right.
so it was very frustrating at first in undergraduate when I discovered IO, but now it's more of like, okay, you make your own path in the professional world, you speak the lingo, you do the things, but then you also do IO on the side as a supplement thing, even though you want it to be the reverse.
Yeah. And so, and it might not be applicable to everyone, but I think one of the most powerful student stories I've had is students who actually they networked initially with leaders in their organization while they were in school. And then I think piqued enough interest where they were updating the leadership within their organization about the projects they were working on. And then those conversations kind of got them into the room after graduation that they absolutely would not have been welcomed into those spaces, or even like people wouldn't have even known they had that skill set if they wouldn't have used that time in graduate school to kind of talk through their learning journey, their skills that they were building while they were in school. But that student took it really seriously, that they were incredibly thoughtful about where they wanted to end up after graduate school, and that they were, kind of building that network as they were going through the program. But I know that's not always the case. I think a lot of times when you're starting a graduate program, you're like, I have no idea where I want to end up. Like, this is exploration, which again, I think that's where networking can really benefit you, that you are talking to people in different spaces and you're like, oh, yep, that's not for me, and that you're not wasting your time getting hired and, like 6 months, a year into a job, you realize that this is not where I want to be.
If I may just jump in really quickly. So I'm actually, I know we're running out of time or out of time, but so I'm starting my graduate program in fall. But I think a big thing for me, at least, is trying to upskill myself specifically in the areas of data analysis and statistics. I think that those are the really big marketable skills. Like, I know IO psychology, we can bring a lot of different perspectives on organizational problems, talking about the heart, but when it comes down to somebody wanting to pay you a 6-figure salary for doing work, I think it's the statistics and the data analysis that are a really great place with which to put your efforts. At least that's my opinion. So yeah, I just wanted to mention as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an obvious, starting point, because I think if you look at data science, data analysis, like, yes, those jobs initially at face value, pay more. And that's actually, I went into data analysis out of graduate school. Again, I was a single mom, that's what I was needing to look into. But if we're being complete, I would actually say, there's a certain level of data analysis you need to understand. It's really how you communicate what it is people are looking at. It's the insights. If you look at like a data insights analyst for HR technology firms, yeah, you're getting a lot of data, but where the gap happens is people not understanding how to translate that. How you tell managers, how you tell the C-suite what the action should be based on what it is they're seeing. Okay, there's a correlation between people saying they trust their leaders and their engagement or their intention to leave, but like, what do we do with that? So absolutely, but I think generally, like, that foundation of data analysis, data collection, just getting used to handling data, usually is part of most graduate programs. But I think if you're wanting to go heavy data science, absolutely, you would need to really lean in on, like, if you're wanting just pure data science roles, you would absolutely need to like lean in on the data science, data analysis piece of learning. Absolutely.
I think that's probably been the most fun part of my current job is learning to look at all the data. And of course, I'm a nerd, so I'm like, wow, look at all these things. And then it's putting it together to where it makes sense. So it's not only just looking at the data, understanding and translating and, doing all the things, is storytelling and data visualization, which is something that we're diving into right now. We're in higher education, but people don't want to look at numbers or just graphs. Like, they want to hear a story. And that's been super fun too, because then you're bringing those analytical skills, but you're also practicing those creative aspects of, let me tell you a story and here's the data, and
Yeah.
people are not falling asleep. So I think it's a cool thing that I get to do, and that we get to do as IOs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, most organizations now have like engagement surveys or some sort of survey data collection they're doing. But what I've found time and time again in talking with like chief human resource officers is that if you don't have a really strong action plan in place based on that data, you're actually doing more harm than good, collecting that data, because people just feel like they're not being listened to. Why am I wasting my time? And I think that you could potentially generate a lot of like negative morale if, one, you don't have an action plan, and also it's not really transparent about the work you're doing. So again, I think that that's where I've done, the research, the data analysis side. And for me, that it was like, okay, I want to get more on understanding how this actually functions, like, what is going on here? How does this actually play out? Boots on the ground. How do you facilitate like moving people to see change? Because that's a totally different story.
That is very true. And I do want to honor JoDee's time and everybody else's time. So I'm going to go ahead and just end our time now. But please feel free to follow me on LinkedIn so you can keep up with everything else. That's the next speakers. I think we're going to have a consultant and then Dr. Rodriguez after that. So we're going to be having some pretty cool conversations following up. But I love today's conversation. I'm so glad that you really brought all of these variant factors and how layered it is to develop all of the skills that we need. It's just a learning process, and above everything, just give yourself time to learn, time to implement, time to make mistakes, and then time to pivot as you need in your career. So JoDee, thank you so much
Yes,
for
thank
coming
you
and making
all.
time.
Yes, it was great talking with you all.
I'm glad. Everybody, if you want to follow her on LinkedIn, she's got some cool stuff on there too. And I will see you all in 2 weeks.